Growing up, hearing about the mission field and knowing how important it is to share the gospel, whether we're here in our own places where the Lord has planted us, or you go out, like the scriptures say, like, was it here and then your community and then to the uttermost parts of the world to make disciples and tell people about Jesus. But we've kind of lost that along the way, it seems. We don't talk much about going out into the mission field anymore. So, Laura Ford, with Global Outreach International, you are joining us to help us look at this conversation a little more closely. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's a really great conversation to have, so I'm always excited to have it.
And you grew up with missionary parents, parents that served our Native American community here in the United States. What was that like?
Yeah, so that's really all I can remember from the time I was born, really. My parents went out. They were church members at Bellevue Baptist Church in Memphis, Tennessee, so very southern roots. But they felt called to go to the mission field, and at that time it was in the 80s, and so it was a very different world really as far as the communications and what we have now. And so a lot of Navajo reservations in the Western United States is what they were initially called to. And I always tell people, in a way, it was a love-hate relationship that I at first had with missions, because I just wanted to, what I felt like, grow up in a normal place, like where there were sidewalks and what felt like normal schools and, uh, just kids and neighborhoods and McDonald's. And so it was pretty barren, honestly. Like, it was really actually very tough to grow up that way. But hindsight, it was also just a really beautiful picture of the way that God can, use people who are broken and to reach the broken. And my family did that so very well. My dad, he always used to say that he was going to introduce the native people to a new tribe, to the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And I always love that because he led out with that contextualization kind of heart, to not press the gospel onto groups, but to really invite them into a loving relationship with, well, he and my mom first and our family, but then also with the Lord. So it was a really unique experience. Even being in the United States, cultural counter cross cultural piece made a really big difference in my life. Yeah, so really just growing up and watching my family really integrate the gospel contextually, like introducing different groups of people to the Lion of the tribe of Judah, instead of pressing in on something that was really a white man's religion when they first were introduced to anything of Christianity. A lot of Catholicism influence that came to the reservations. And honestly, it's hard to talk about, but it was very oppressive. And so coming back into people already on the defense, I watched my parents do a really beautiful job of integrating relationships and just really being able to meet people's needs and show the gospel through that genuine love and sincerity. So it definitely left an impression on me, growing up, for sure.
Laura, as you talk about the fact that it wasn't the easiest place to grow up in, you didn't have the comforts that many of us have come to not just enjoy, but expect. There's a fear that I think some people may have. If I go do something like this, it's going to be hard on my family. This could be challenging for my wife or my kids. And so there may be a hesitancy for people to step out and do something that is going to feel tough. That's going to feel real hard. But what do you think that the impact of your family doing this together had on you guys and even the kind of cumulative faith of your family?
Absolutely. I think, Steve, there's really two components to that, too. One, naturally, our natural inclination is to not want to be scattered, right? We see that at the Tower of Babel. We want to come together. We want to do something that feels comfortable, make a name for ourselves. And that really is, sadly, our sinful nature, but at the same time, a very human response to wanting safety and security. But yet, when we read scripture and when we see that everything in scripture, God calls us outside of that, and he calls us outside of our comfort zone, he even calls us to suffer is so countercultural to what we learn today, and sometimes it's even counter Christian to the Christian circles of what we hear about prosperity and comfort and self care. Like, all of these things are good, and we, as a mom of two teenage daughters, like, my first priority is I want to protect them, right? Like, I don't want them to go somewhere where they're uncomfortable, far away from me, and suffer. But at the same time, we miss that that deep desire, that deep call to really fulfill the great commission that God has placed in every single one of us, and sometimes we just can't even recognize it. And so I always try to tell people, when they're worried about what that would look like for them or for their families, doing anything with God, He always reveals the next step. He never just throws us out in the deep end, right? So when people are pursuing a call to missions, they're slowly walking toward a path that God has already laid out for them, and He is with them in it. So I even saw that in my own family. It was not easy. And I think that's another thing that's okay to talk about, a lot more, even that it is going to be hard. So you're setting the expectation early. Like, don't give me a false expectation that this is just going to be easy. It is going to be hard and there is going to be suffering. But our response to suffering really leads us into a deeper intimacy with Christ, because we're seeing a side of Him that we don't always get to see unless we're suffering with Him. And I also have read that the calling of God. Oswald Chambers might sound, my utmost for His highest is very familiar devotion that so many people have read, but he wrote one of his devotions on that the call to God, doing God's will and walking in His will, is so much like a call to the sea. It's like a sailor who they went out, they got beat up, they're maybe almost shipwrecked and survived, and they can't stay on land very long because that call within them is so heavy and it's so compelling that they just have to get back out there. And so I think that once we catch that deep resonating call of God, that is what compels us. His love and His sacrifice and everything He is compels us. And then it sustains us. So I watched God every day sustain my family through some intense hardships. I had a little brother die in a terrible car accident at 21. God sustained us in that. My mom died of cancer in her 50s. God sustained us in that. I just lost my father to cancer this past February. God has sustained what's left of my family, one brother and a sister that's 9 years younger. Um, he sustained us in that. And when I look at the legacy that my parents have left, it's truly one that unashamedly followed Christ wherever He led them. And so I think it's those kinds of messages and those kinds of testimonials that we've got to get to people and say, yes, it's hard, but Jesus is absolutely worth it, because we were worth it to Him on the cross. And so He is worth it. He is worth it for us.
Oh, he is. He is worth it, and we do lose that perspective. We're so busy thinking about how is it going to impact us. We're not thinking about how the gospel will impact others. And if we'll make ourselves available, the Lord will do it. I appreciate though, Laura, that you say it's not going to be easy. Let's talk about how it's not going to be easy. And when parents come alongside their young people and global outreach international, here's the concern of a parent's heart. How can you help give them peace and to turn to the Lord, even though it's something that's super uncomfortable for a parent to say, okay, you have my blessing, go to the mission field?
Right. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think about this, I have two teenage daughters, so they're 14 and 16. So much I think of for us as parents is that continually letting go. Like, our trust has got to be greater in God's sovereignty over all things than it has got to be even in our ability to protect our own children. And so when we think about, you know, our children are probably just as susceptible to getting in a horrible car accident. I mean, within the United States, in a little community that they're living in, than they are something overseas. And I don't mean to diminish the hardships and the distance and all the things, but I think constantly reminding parents that, you know, we're always in the process of letting go and trusting God that He will truly protect them. And, I think you've probably heard, as we have too, it's like the safest place to be is in the center of God's will. And so I try to encourage parents in that to say, their call is an opportunity for you to exercise a greater faith in who God is in your life. Is He Lord over your whole life and over your whole family? And so, again, it comes back to those deep spiritual truths and that walk and those steps of faith that we've all got to have. And that we're all, like Corey Ten Boom said, holding things loosely, because that's truly what it's all about. And in gentleness, because again, gentleness, I would never have an expectation of like, come on, get with it, let your, child
Right.
go like that.
Sure.
But in gentleness, just saying, listen, pray and seek the Lord yourself and let Him speak to you through His word and settle your spirit and settle your anxious heart on behalf of His child as well as yours, because we do have to let them go and we do have to give them those opportunities to walk and take ownership of their faith. It's funny, when I was 17 years old, my parents signed for me to join the military. So that's kind of where the trajectory that I was on. And in a way, they were signing me over to doing something that was really outside of their control or reach. So I think sometimes when we think about the context of what we would allow our child to go do, seemingly thinking that it's maybe a little bit safer than a missions call, we kind of have to get that perspective as well. Saying like, is this really outside of the scope of things that we would want them to pursue, even in other avenues of life?
Laura, I'm also thinking of the parents who can say, in one sense, I get that God has my kids in the safety of His hand, and He's sovereign over that. However, I'm not necessarily sure I want my kids to go because I don't want them to be missing. And it's maybe not even their kids, it's their grandkids. I don't want to be missing birthdays and Christmases and holidays and the family get togethers and things like that. If my kids go to the mission field, they're taking my grandkids with them in doing that. They're going to miss out on all sorts of opportunities that we could have as a family to do things. And so maybe for some, it's not even as much about safety as it is they're bursting my expectation of
Mhm.
what I thought my life was going to look like with them and what my expectation of their life was going to look like. When you're working with people who want to go to the mission field, feel the call of God to go on their life, and they're coming up against pushback from parents over objections along those lines, how do you counsel them? How do you potentially even talk to the authority figures in their life?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, it's funny. As you were asking that, I was reminded too of our CEO, John, CEO of Global Outreach. He tells a funny story about when they sat down, their children, he and his wife, their children were, I think just born and very little. And they had this kind of confrontation type of conversation, with the parents. And telling them that they were going to be going to Ecuador and starting this El Refugio base camp for, to help with kids and doing all this stuff. And the first question from the grandparents was, well, you're leaving the children here, right? Like, like they were like, surely you're not taking them away from us. Like, so you're going to leave them with us, right? And so and they were actually kind of serious, so I just find that so hilarious. But no, that is so valid. And again, I think it just really goes back to the surrender really hits all the family, right? We're all surrendering something. Like you said, the expectation. We sometimes, I mean, we've got to get to a place, and again, not expecting that everybody would get here right away, but we've got to get to a place, and I would urge someone to come to the place of saying, you know give God your unmet expectations. Lament those to him. He can take it. Because you don't want to send your loved ones away with bitterness in your heart, bitterness toward God, right? So it all comes down to that personal relationship that we have and that dependence that we have and the need that we have for God to really settle us in those areas where expectations will not be met. And it's valid. I mean, that is something that some parents and grandparents, that have lived for, is to have the birthdays and have the parties and have the sleepovers with grandma and grandpa, and I think growing up, this was especially hard, even on our family, because we could not travel as much even to the other side of the country, let alone um, another country or, another continent. And so I didn't have very close relationships with my grandparents, like I would have loved to have. And the same with even my girls with my parents. Once we had moved so far away, there are opportunities to visit and to make up for that and to maybe like say, okay, you guys are coming home on furlough. And so we're going to take the month of whatever you're home and we're going to do all the birthdays. So I think there's ways to integrate that so you're not missing out on the opportunity that you have to share those special occasions, but also, again, going back to I'm surrendering my expectations and something I desire for something so much greater that has an eternal impact, or like Peter said, that there's that joy that surpasses, there's a suffering that, the glory far outweighs the suffering. That's like the verse I'm trying to get back to do, but like it's so far out, these temporary sufferings, the glory that we will achieve one day and that we will set our eyes on far outweighs them all. And so being able to take those grievances to God, being able to lament the things that seem like are our right to have, um, is just another point of surrendering those things on the altar to God. Yeah, with gentleness, I would really turn someone more toward that deeper intimacy with the Lord and laying those burdens before Him and lamenting those to Him and asking Him to put healing salve and healing balm on those places of pain and loss.
Oh, and like you said, Laura, be honest. So we can't hide these things. God knows them. He knows us better than we know ourselves. But for us and for our sake to be able to lay that, articulate it to the Lord and learn to trust Him on a level that maybe we haven't before. There's always more depth that we can have with the living God and that relationship that He's offered to us. I think that with your parents serving here on U.S. soil, we know that people do go internationally, but you would say through global outreach, international, I don't know why I'm stuttering on that, global outreach international, GOI, that you can even serve, you don't even have to leave your community. You can serve in so many different ways. And I know that there are short-term mission trips where you can travel. Tell us a little bit about what GOI is doing.
Absolutely. I mean, we definitely are a sending and a supporting agency for long term missions. So, when I say long term missions, it's like 2 years plus. So, our desire is for someone who is inquiring with us and says, I want to work with a hospital over in Uganda, and I need a sending agency to put key pieces in my life to help me do that. And that's what we do. We onboard them, we give them some training, we help set them up with some fund number to facilitate their raised funds. We teach them how to raise funds. We work with them on missionary care to provide them missionary care while they're overseas. And so they get assigned a care coordinator to facilitate that for them and check in with them. We have a missionary kids coordinator as well. So those relationships begin to be established for that kind of support that they so desperately need while they are at our missionary orientation training, which is part of our onboarding process. So that's kind of what we do for our long term missionaries. But we do have short term opportunities where we have some very short term, like 10-day trips that someone can go on. We call it a ministry tour. They can get the sense of what life would be like on the mission field by spending time with our missionaries, doing some sightseeing in the country of their interest. We like them to go to a grocery store and try to pick out a few items, because you're, dealing with language barriers and like different ways that things work. So it's kind of a fun exercise. So we have opportunities like that. And then we have some follow-up opportunities for younger people who are interested in doing like either a 1 month or a 6 month or even sometimes a year internship based on their availability and their times. I think that's what's one of the beautiful things, like tying it back into around to some of the younger generations, is they don't have to, like I said, get thrown in the deep end. We've got a lot of steps along the way to build up to something that's more long term. And so that's kind of where we are with global outreach, as far as, we just want to be somebody that can help you with a next step. And that's really what I do and my mobilization team does, is we'll talk to anybody on the spectrum of mobilization, whether they're like, I just want to get engaged in a mission opportunity, and I'll suggest a class that they could attend, or I'll suggest a book that they could read, or I'll say, do you want to become part of the farm? And that's a way to, like, literally for 19.99 a month, somebody knows that they're contributing to sending a missionary, either short term or long term, and helping do that. Praying for unreached people groups. There's an app, there's a Joshua Project app, many other apps that you can download and sit around the dining room table and pray for an unreached people group as you're engaging in what is really the strategy, I feel, of missions, is prayer. I mean, what did Jesus say? Like, pray to the Lord of the harvest to send more workers into his harvest field. And so right away, if somebody's asking me, like, how can I get engaged in missions? And the first thing I'll say is, like, pray for missionaries. Learn some names. I'll give you some names, or like go to our website, and what's an area that God has pricked on your heart? Begin to pray, begin to invest your time in prayer and resources, and then look for opportunities to actually physically engage, if you have the time and availability, in some sort of trip or short-term opportunity.
Well, the website, if you want to get more information, is globaloutreach.org. Laura Ford is the Director of Mobilization for Global Outreach International. And Laura, appreciate you just taking some time and having this conversation with us. And I hope that if you have come across this podcast and you have any interest in missions, God maybe tugging on your heart in some way, that you'll check them out. It's globaloutreach.org. You can also find out more about Laura, laurak4.com, but we'll put those links in the show notes. So if you forget the websites, don't worry. Check out the show notes, and we're going to have that information there for you. Also, thanks to Raphael's Roastery for helping to make this possible. Appreciate their support. And thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being our plus one.